Hi everyone, Leaf Reed here, and today I'm looking at The King in Yellow by Robert W. Chambers. With The King in Yellow, it was kind of turn of the century horror style kind of writing, similar to, I would guess, H.P. Lovecraft a little bit later or after him. And so The King in Yellow is a really interesting book in such that The King in Yellow is not actually a character in the book, but rather it's a book that exists in this universe. So this is a series of short stories of, different characters from America, England, and France, and they all talk in whispers about the King in Yellow. And so what the King in Yellow is this book that's been written by some unknown author, and in the book it is this dark, tragic, but also mesmerizing, haunting poetry. And the idea is that if you read this book, you will become possessed and you'll become part of this cult of the King of Yellow or something. And it's just this really, just an amazing style and an idea that I really enjoy. It's almost like an episodic TV series where you have all these weird paranormal things happen, but there's always this long running arching thing. And so you never really get explained what the King in Yellow is, except that he lives on some alien planet by Hastur. There's some lake by Cordova under the black starless sky or something, and how there's a moon descending. So very, semi-apocalyptic imagery, I guess, or it's just very haunting and beautiful, and how he's a man who wears the pallid mask, who wears a tattered yellow cape, and there's some woman he's in love with. You only get bits and pieces of it, which makes it feel super mysterious and really, really interesting for that reason. I should bring up, though, that one of the main reasons I'm actually reading this is because of a game called Signalis. And Signalis is a very it's a very interesting game, but it's heavily influenced. It's made by a couple of Germans, indie developers, but heavily influenced by anime like Ghost in the Shell, Evangelion, but mostly horror things. And so it's a survival horror game in space about, time loops and, an infinite promise and a haunting desire and memory. So a little bit of Silent Hill. Signalis is really good, by the way. You should go play it. But one of the long-running I don't think it's a long-running thing, but like the last object you get in the game before the final boss is this book. So this was the main inspiration for the game, and I love art that leads me to other art. However, I have to admit I prefer Signalis much more as a piece of media over this, because Signalis has a very, it does have that charm and that sense of mystery about it, but it also has a very kind of defined, artistic, exotic, complex storytelling, and this is just like one piece of inspiration. So I was a little bit honestly disappointed when I went into this, because I felt let down that this didn't deliver the hard-hitting content, or like a more in-depth revelation of the themes and characters present in Signalis. This is, if anything, this is kind of derivative. This feels like it was based on the game rather than the other way around, which is very odd, very unusual. But yeah, so let's just kind of go into a few of the stories. So the first one I think is the Redeemer of, the Repairer of Reputations. It's a very strange story, and honestly, I don't really like any of the stories except for two of them in here, because it's very convoluted. It's kind of all over the place. But the main idea is that there's this guy, I forget his name, but he's an American. He's living in New York. It's this weird semi-alternate timeline where it's the 1920s, and the American government has installed voluntary suicide chambers throughout the city, which do play a part in the role, but it's really not about that. It's about this other guy, Mr. Wilde, who is the repairer of reputations, and this guy goes to him and basically talks to him and says, I need to, I think he says I have to repair someone's reputation, but they actually end up conversing about the King in Yellow, and how it's like this hidden thing you're not supposed to talk about, but hey, you know about it and I know about it, so we're going to discuss it. The repair of reputations, he says, I have this person on retainer for this amount because on this day in November they disgrace themselves at this gala, or someone cheated on their exam or test or something, or this person cheated on their spouse, and he repairs their reputation. And he says he has hundreds of people in his employ, and he pays them very little, but they don't complain about it. But it never actually gets, I mean, it never really gets to how their reputation is repaired. It's really weird, but somehow they do it, I guess. And aside from that, so the main character, he also has a cousin, this very beautiful girl, Constance, I think her name was, and she is engaged to this guy called Louis, who is a part of like the military or something, or some kind of royal regiment in Europe. And so he's here. They're going to get married soon, and he's very amiable with Louis and and his cousin, and they're all good. And then he essentially goes back to his apartment one day, and he reveals there's a safe in the back of his thing, and he opens up the safe, and he puts on this diadem of something. I think it's actually like just a paper mache or some kind of cheaply made thing, but he thinks it's a diadem of gold and rubies and sapphires and things like that. And then he'll put on this like white cloak, which are really like curtains or bedsheets or something, and he'll pretend to be not the King in Yellow, but like some kind of entity, and he'll start dancing around his room madly, and his personality is completely changed. And essentially he's possessed by this idea that his cousin is the Queen of Avalon, the very first progenitor of the British people and the British Isles, and that she cannot marry this guy because he's a deceiver, and that she should instead marry this list of, I know, like 100 other guys that he say all are dukes of the King in Yellow. And so he has this split personality which jumps back and forth, and he goes back to see the repairer, Mr. Wilde, who's this short, wrinkly, angry old man, and his cat's always attacking him, and he's always quarreling with his cat, basically. And he goes back to him one evening, and something happens. I forget what, but he basically confesses to Louis that, and to his cousin that she can't marry, that they can't be married because of this awful thing. And he ends up running back screaming, and goes back to his apartment and puts on his diadem and his crown and say, it is done, basically. And so it's really hard to honestly to decipher, but he basically goes back to Mr. Wilde, whose throat has been torn open, and he doesn't know by what, and he goes on this maddening rant about how the throne of the King of Yellow has been seized, or rather it's been, you've dared try to take it, and now your crown of death is upon you. And then it just says in the newspaper the next day that the main character died. So yeah, it's like this wild random thing where they combine a literary style of him explaining his day-to-day life and meeting with so-and-so and how everything's fine, and then suddenly he starts talking to this one guy, and they bring up the King of Yellow, and his whole literary style changes, and it goes just into his descent into madness. And yeah, I wish this had some kind of relevancy to the story in the game, but it really doesn't. It's just kind of like, yes, there's this dreamlike quality where you can slip in between different things, but there's so much more to that. They also use I forget the name of the artist. It starts with a B, like Brom or Bran or something. But he did a series of paintings called the Islands of Death and the Island of Life, and so each island represents a different stage in life. And the Island of Death is the one that is a painting that shows up continuously throughout the game. And so it shows kind of like a stage in life and its transformation, and that in one of the levels that that you actually go to it kind of is sort of implying that it definitely reminds me of how it describes the King in Yellow, how he has this lake of something by Hastur under the darkness, skyless sea of stars. And that's only a kind of inference I got, that you have this wild, maddening, possessive dream that makes you go insane. But that's the only relevance here. There is definitely romantic qualities in the rest of the stories. For example, Yeah, so and the second story, The Mask, is actually my favorite. So my favorites are probably The Mask and Rue Barry. And so what you'll find here is that while that first story was in America, New York, the rest of these stories, they mostly take place in Paris. So the guy was definitely a Parisophile. And so The Mask, I really like it because it's this kind of simple story where you have, what was it, an artist and his model that he's in love with, and her boyfriend basically, and so also their friend. So it's kind of like a love triangle. So she's in love with her. No, so it's Alec, who's the artist, who's in love with Genevieve, and Genevieve is betrothed to what's his name, Boris. And so they're in their studio apartment in Paris, and he's painting her, drawing her, etc., trying to capture her. And what occurs is that or by some happenstance, he comes across this special liquid that has some strange chemical reaction where anything you dump into it turns to marble. And so he did a goldfish, he does a plant, he does whatever. And what happens is Genevieve, she is kind of like, they kind of have this thing where there's this tension between them, where it's like he's in love with her and she knows, but he can't say it because she's already with Boris. And what happens is at some point she becomes deathly ill and starts coughing and is on a deathbed basically. And what occurs is that, when she's close to dying, she kind of reveals that she has true feelings for actually Alec, the artist. And Alec, it's this really beautiful scene where he keeps this strange experimental liquid in this kind of marble bath where it's able to kind of sustain itself. And at some point he realizes the power of the thing he has, that in order to turn anything into marble, he kind of realizes that it not only is unethical and dangerous, but from an artistic standpoint, if you can use technical prowess to perfectly capture something without any effort or artistry or deviation in style, then suddenly it makes art pointless. And that's very much what the art world was going through at that time, where you mentioned of cameras. What's the point of a painting if a camera's just going to do it 100% one-to-one? Technically perfect, but missing all the weird stylistic imperfections of someone recreating it using paints and oils on a canvas. And so what has essentially occurred is that it's the same thing but with sculpting, that it just perfectly preserves anything that's thrown into it. So what happens is, basically Genevieve, it does kind of alludes to it, it's not very direct, but it's kind of like she falls into this marble bath, or they think she's gone missing, right? And so Boris is like, oh well, she was going to die anyway, I've already lost her. If she's missing or dead, I guess it's the same loss. And so he goes on a trip. Alec goes also on a trip on the Orient Express all the way to Turkey, and then he kind of comes all the way back. And when he arrives, it's been 2 years since his travels, and he notices, and he comes back and he notices, Madam whatever, his servant, like, why is there a goldfish in this tank? He says, oh well, I just found it. It just it was just always been there. And he says, oh, that's odd. And then he found the bouquet of flowers that he had also frozen in the liquid, and they had come back to life. And so all of these things in a 2-year spectrum are returning from their marbleized form. And so he goes into his upstairs apartment and he opens it up and finds, it's kind of anticipated. He says he approaches with realization or revelation, awaiting to see his one true love uncovered in full. And so it's a very romantic story because you have this love dynamic, but it's also, I like the sense of mystery it has. There's this strange chemical compound that has this magical property. No one understands how it works. We don't care how it works. And it's through the thing that they don't understand that acts as the catalyst to the miracle or the romance. And so it's one of those stories where you don't really need to understand it. You just have to appreciate the sense of mystery of of this thing, and how love in itself, how he thought, oh, he'll never be able to be with Genevieve because of Boris, and so he was able to essentially have that miracle by through the means of the thing that he did not understand, the thing that was beyond him, this, something truly mysterious. So I really like that one. That was actually my favorite one in this book. So yeah, the themes of mystery, and in the story they also do mention the King of Yellow saying, oh, I never want to touch it or read it. And I think it was Genevieve got sick because she opened up the book because it was on his mantelpiece. Someone had brought it to him as a gift, and so she just picked it up inadvertently and had started reading it and became deathly ill. And so yeah, it's just this on-running thing. And so he, it just emanates that emotion of lovers who are brought together at the end of time. So I guess in some ways, I'm saying this a lot, it does really reflect a lot of the ideas and themes in Signalis, that there are two people who are fated to be together, and through that fate and the destiny, even if it takes millions, thousands of years, and not even the same physical person, but the idea of the person inhabiting a non-physical body, or a different body, it's like that promise, that redemption, that desire still exists eternally, which is very romantic and very tragic in the way that if that doesn't happen, then it is a tragedy, and there's like some punishment, there's some sin, like James and his wife in Silent Hill. Very similar in that sense. There's a very short one in The Court of the Dragon. This one's just an acid trip, frankly. Well, not an acid trip, but I mean it's a light trip where there's this guy. He's sitting in church. He's looking at the priest, and he notices that the priest, he's looking at the parish while he's doing his speech, but he feels like he's staring at him specifically, almost angrily at some moment. And so the guy starts feeling very disoriented and very uncomfortable, and so he's like, okay, this is a little bit too intense for me, and he leaves the church early. And what transpires is, frankly, what sounds like Robert's personal dream, where he starts walking through the courtyard, and the courtyard turns into his apartment, and the priest is basically following him, and he's having dreams of, like, the King in Yellow and this priest guy, and just everything's all kind of jumbled, and it's very surreal in tone. Yeah, I think it's this one. The Yellow Sign is when a really great little story where it's okay, where they live in this apartment in London or somewhere, and this guy basically sees his roommate or his sister or something, like Tessie. She has this dream of this hearse driver, and that he's passing by in the street below, and they're on the second floor, and her dream is that she'll look down at him, he'll look up at her, and then she'll see herself in the hearse, in the casket. So I'm sure this is something that Robert probably experienced personally. He was like looking down from an apartment and saw a hearse driver, and maybe there's a see-through top or something, and he saw the body beneath, and he thought, oh, what if that was me? I don't know. And I think what happens is there's the main character where she assures her, no, that's crazy, don't worry about it. And then there's something where he comes across the King in Yellow, and he reads a bit of it, and and I think the Yellow Sign gives you the most lore on the King of Yellow, what he's like, what the deal is, what are the moons of Callisto or whatever. And so he ends up having this experience where then it kind of ends with him living her dream, where he realizes he's stuck looking up in this hearse, and he sees Tessie from their own apartment window, and he's stuck in the hearse now, and that's kind of his reality. I'm just going to go to the Yellow Sign just because I want to read a bit of how the characters talk about the King in Yellow. It's kind of similar to the idea of a tribute, that you can't recreate this thing, or you can only talk about it or mention it. It's kind of like Voldemort. You can't mention it in full because it's so powerful. It's so devastating. Okay, so here it is. So this is where Tessie, she's the one who accidentally opens up the King in Yellow, and she accidentally reads it, and she kind of goes into this unconscious state before he can get to her, and she falls asleep. And when she awakes, this is what they kind of talk about. We had been speaking for some time in dull monotonous strain before I realized that we were discussing the King in Yellow. Oh, the sin of writing such words, words which are clear as crystal, limpid and musical as bubbling springs, words which sparkle and glow like the poisoned diamonds of the Medicis. Oh, the wickedness, the hopeless damnation of a soul who could fascinate and paralyze human creatures with such words, words understood by the ignorant and wise alike, words which are more precious than jewels, more soothing than music, more awful than death. We talked on, unmindful of the gathering shadows, and she was begging me to throw away the clasp of black onyx, quaintly inlaid with what we now knew to be the yellow sign. I never shall know why I refused, even though at this hour, here in my bedroom, as I write this confession, I should be glad to know what it was that prevented me from tearing the yellow sign off my breast and casting it into the fire. I am sure I wished to do so, and yet Tessie pleaded with me in the vain. Night fell and the hours dragged on, but still we murmured to each other of the King of Yellow and the pallid mask. And midnight surrounded from the misty spires of the fog-wrapped city. We spoke of Hastur and of Casilda, while outside the fog rolled against the bank window panes and the clouds rolled on, and the break of the shores of Halley. So it's almost like they're taking possession, and so they go on these rants about, oh, wait, actually I found a good passage here. Feverishly I struggled to put it from me, but I saw the lake of Halley, thin and blank, without a ripple or wind to stir it, and I saw the towers of Carcosa behind the moon, Aldebaran and Hyades, Alar, Hastur, glided through the cloud rifts which fluttered and flapped as they pressed like the scalloped tatters of the King in Yellow. Among all these, one sane thought persisted. It never wavered, no matter what else was going on in my disordered mind, that my chief reason for existing was to meet some requirement of Boris and Genevieve. Anyway, so it just intersplices, these same themes about the moons and the lake and the setting and the king, and these images which are dreamlike in quality. Anyway. And that's kind of, those are the four main stories where they have that running line. And the rest of these are actually just kind of just general romantic stories. There's actually a bit of poetry from, the Poet's Paradise downward. So, you can get a fix for, the length of some of these stories. You have the Street of the Four Winds, the Street of the First Shell, a bunch of other poetry. And then these are just like general, just like short stories about, Parisian life, basically, and the bustle of the city. But my favorite one is actually the last one, Rue Berry. And Rue Berry, I love the story because it's very iconic. It stays in your mind, where essentially there is an art school of all these young painters in Paris, and they're all very eager to, start their careers and whatever. But one of them, notices, I was walking down, Rue Berry, and I saw this amazingly beautiful woman who was alone, unattended, and, basically, was very striking. I saw a man approach her, and she just completely ignored him. And so this young artist falls in love with this woman, and they kind of turn him and say, oh, everyone knows her. And like, well, what do you mean? That's Rue Berry. Like, okay, but what's her name? It's like, she doesn't have a name. Everyone knows her because she's this mysterious figure who never tells her name, never gives any man or woman the time of day, and she is essentially a complete enigma. And so because no one knows her name, they just refer to her as Rue Berry. That she lives on that street, she walks down that street, and she has rejected literally everyone who has tried to court her. and she dresses herself up, she takes care of herself, and she's the most beautiful woman, in Paris. And she refuses to talk to anyone, and they don't even know her name. So it's this very mysterious romantic thing, and the artist is, oh, I don't have a chance, but I'm going to go for it anyway. And so just their little story about, the the rose-filled gardens and overhangs of Paris, and the beautiful woman that everyone's trying to court, and how she's a big mystery, and she in a way embodies that location, that she exists in the space and time, and her nature is reflective of the time frame and the area, and how she is an enigmatic, beautiful, and lost to time figure. And I won't spoil how it ends, but it's very kind of not direct, and again romantic. But yeah, that's The King in Yellow, a very strange mixture of romance and horror, really. And when I really think about it, that is the real core theme of this book. It's a mixture of romance and horror when I really think about it. And Signalis is very much the same thing. It's about romance and horror, and also promises, vows, and broken vows, usually. And I always like psychological horror because it's usually about the subconscious mind dealing with regret or a broken promise, and how you need to confront that aspect of yourself in your life. And it's so much more interesting than having someone sit down and explain, oh, well, this happened and it was so bad, rather than having their own experience, how it feels to. I mean, in the way that the Silent Hill 2 director said, he said that he wanted to shake the human heart. So I find that very interesting. And to combine that sense of romance and loss, but also with horror. And here it's definitely more on the romantic side, obviously, and more kind of upbeat and happy, or not upbeat, but it's still like morose and a bit somber, but there's more romance, obviously, than there is tragedy. So a really interesting just mixture of different ideas for love and love lost and love found, and working through that to find love. Yeah, that's pretty much the book, and that's pretty much the game. I highly recommend the game. I don't really recommend this book. Like, it's interesting, I guess, if you've played Signalis and you want to like extend your enjoyment of that game. But on its own, is it really anything amazing? It's kind of interesting, I guess, but I can't super recommend this. I think, it would be more interesting to read Lovecraft's works. And I would like to see something like this, though. Something more direct, where it combines the elements of horror and romance together. I think that would be a really cool idea. So the principle of this book is really interesting. I just think the way it executes it feels kind of fumbled, kind of half-baked. A lot more could be done with it. And yeah, I know, I guess that's all I have to say about it. Anyway, that's all I've got for now. And as always, guys, keep reading. Bye.